Hey everyone, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'm going to be replacing an old rotting staircase and building a new set from scratch, and also adding some flair along the way, including lights, a window, and some really cool custom railing panels, so keep watching to check out this build process. I must admit that this job was a bit of a departure from my normal type of work, which is mainly indoor built-ins and furniture, but I was definitely intrigued at the prospect of doing some outdoor construction type work, and I've always found these types of projects to be incredibly valuable for learning and gaining experience at different kinds of builds. For this job, the client invited me over to take a look and said that he had another contractor over not too long ago doing some roof work, and as they descended down the stairs, one of the treads broke loose and they fell through. Didn't sound like they got injured, and unclear whether there is a lawsuit coming in the future, but in any case, it was time for an update. It's a very New Mexican thing right here. Hey, keep chilling. Alright, I won't bother you. Ultimately, we decided just to take down the old staircase and replace everything, since a lot of the wood looked to be rotted and we didn't want to take any chances. Previously, this space under the stairs was enclosed as a storage area, but for the new design it was decided to keep it open, kind of like a nook where you could wheel the barbecue in and out of. I had entirely too much fun taking a hammer to this old staircase, which really only took a couple of hours to bring down. A lot of the areas that were rotted with nails I was able to brute force pretty easily with only minor injuries and a touch of tetanus. There were a couple 4x4 main supports that were in place that supported the upper deck, and those looked to still be in okay shape, so I kept those, which will be important later on because I'm going to be anchoring the new staircase to those for added stability. With the old defeated staircase left in a pile in the yard, I started bringing in all the materials for the new stairs. I'm going to have 3 total stringers for the 30-inch width of the stairs, and those are going to be made from 2x12 pressure-treated lumber. And for pretty much all of the framing components, I'm going with pressure-treated, which is slightly more expensive, but will really help to extend the life of the boards and keep them resistant to rot and insects. It was not very long at all into this build where I made my first major mistake, and this one would really go on to haunt me throughout the build. I made a quick jig with a straight edge, a square, and some clamps to mark out the lines for my stringers, which would have worked great if the board I was marking had a straight edge on it, but it turned out that the board I was marking had a massive crown, about 1.5 inches, and I just failed to notice it as I was making these marks. Basically what this led to was the stringers looking like they have a sag in the metal since the stringer notches followed that line of the crown. Later on, I did find some ways to compensate for this somewhat, but I still feel really bummed out even while watching this back now, because even though I really like how it all came together, if you are looking for it, you can still see some of that bowing on the final product, which is very annoying, but you live and learn, I guess, and I'll be sure not to make this mistake in the future. I went ahead and used the one stringer I cut out as a template for the other 2 so I could at least have some consistency between the 3, and of course, as Slim Charles said,
and now there ain't no going back. I mean, shit. Once you in it, you in it.
After mounting a new ledger board to the edge of the deck, I got started attaching the stringers to the board with some Simpson adjustable stringer connectors. These are nice because they conform to the angle of the stairs, hence them being adjustable. And I know that I'm not being incredibly detailed on a lot of these steps, and that's because this truly is a very long build, and I'm just trying to get through the whole process with a reasonable length on this video. But if I had to describe some key takeaways with the stringers, there are some great stair calculators out there for free, just Google the term, and they make it really easy to calculate the rise and the run of each step, and I just followed that as I did this. I'll also say that cutting the stringers were a huge pain, mainly because the blade kept getting pinched, so I would recommend doing multiple passes for those. Here I mounted a 2x4 into the concrete under those notches I cut out of the bottom of the stringers earlier, and I'm just drilling out some pilot holes with a hammer drill and driving in some Tapcon concrete screws, and this just helps to keep the stringers from sliding outwards. With the stringers up, I got to work on the treads, and I'm making these out of deck boards I picked up at Lowe's. The actual dimensions on these are 1 inch thick and 5¼ inch wide, and these are also pressure treated. I did some minor cleanup on the planer, and I ended up ripping half the boards a bit thinner, and that's because it was going to take 2 boards to cover the depth of each step, and to get the overhang length I wanted, I needed to take off about 1 inch from the boards that would sit on the inner side against the risers. As in most of my builds, I wanted to try and make these stairs in line with the aesthetic taste of the client, and to get a better sense of the kind of look he would prefer, I sent over a couple sample pics of other far nicer staircases than anything I could build, and ultimately he picked out this one as a style he liked, and this gave me something to strive for. I did my best to color match the treads in that picture using some deck stain and sealer, and this color is mahogany, which personally I think looks really nice, and I ended up going with 2 coats on these. To install the treads, I'm taking the easy route here and just screwing them down from the top using some color matching deck screws. The biggest trick was making sure that the treads were level, and because of my F up earlier with the stringers, most of the steps were not level, so the shimming was real. And I first tacked them in place with a brad nailer, screwed down the boards, and then broke off the excess pieces after the treads were secured. Keeping in line with the inspo photo, I went ahead and installed risers as well, and these are 1x pine risers that I picked up from Lowe's. The risers also needed quite a bit of shimming to make sure they were plumb, so much of this process was similar to the tread installation. Although I did have to cut these down to size on site using a track saw. Typically the risers sit behind the treads and not on top of them, but in the case of these stairs I had to make them a bit steeper than your standard staircase because the concrete pad was a little short and the deck was pretty tall. With the stairs being taller than the standard riser boards I was using, I needed the extra height from the treads to make these boards work. Hopefully that makes some sense, and I'm sure there are better ways of doing this, but this was the best I could come up with. Adding the treads and the risers did a lot to stabilize the stringers, but I definitely wanted to add some beef to the structure, so I got to work on some vertical supports, and I made these out of 4x4 boards, which would not only add support, but these are also going to be the structure for the hand railing and the panels. I also wanted to make sure these supports were properly secured and raised above the concrete foundation, so I anchored a couple of steel post holders down with 1/2-inch concrete wedge anchors. These aren't too bad to install with the right tools, so for something like this, a hammer drill is basically a requirement. For the first railing section, I pre-assembled using dominoes for alignment, and I picked up a bunch of these insane 6-inch long SDWS timber screws. And these screws are awesome. I didn't have to pre-drill anything, and they had crazy holding power, so it made things really easy and secure to move around after I had it screwed together. I cut the horizontal pieces at the angle of the stairs, which I got from the stair calculator site that I used earlier for the stair stringers. I hammered in some nails to attach the posts to the post holders, and then drove in some screws from the side to attach the supports to the stringer section. Once I had this first section up, I just built everything up from there using that as a reference. I added some 2x10 boards to the sides to act as a stair skirt and also add some stability. And then I added the upper railing section using more 4x4 boards, and with these I attached to the existing 4x4s that were already up supporting the upper deck. Of course, this being the edited footage, it looks like everything's going swimmingly, but the reality of these projects is much different with a ton of measuring and planning and recutting. But I will say this project, and especially this framing part, is just a great reminder to me about why I love this kind of work, because it's really just so much fun watching things take shape. For me, it's the beauty of building, and it's why I don't miss my desk job at all. I mean, sure, I'm hemorrhaging money right now, so I don't know how long I'm going to be able to keep doing this kind of work and still stay afloat financially, but at least for now, I'm trying to get the most out of this experience. Not to say it's not frustrating. In fact, it's more frustrating than anything I've ever tried before, but there's always some kind of advancement happening, and that's the best part. It's starting to look like a staircase. One thing that was cool about this build in particular is that stairs actually have a lot of different styles and potential features, which allowed for some opportunity for customization with the design. Ultimately, we thought it would look better and be more functional to have a structure under the stairs, which would provide some wind protection for the patio, along with a bit of an enclosed storage space, not to mention even more added stability to the stairs themselves. To make the framing for the wall structure, I ended up notching out the tops of the vertical studs so that they would kind of straddle the outside stair stringer. Doing it this way just made it a bit easier for me to install it tight to that stair stringer, and this definitely wasn't going to be load bearing. The most important thing was to make sure that it was solid enough to hold up to the strong winds that are pretty much constant around this area. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there's a 10,000 foot peak just on the east side of the city, and it seems like all the areas near the base of the mountain are constantly windy. I don't know if mountains just cause more wind. It's been a while since I've learned anything about the circulatory system, but I've definitely noticed that. One problem with a solid wall here is that it's going to block out a lot of the evening sunlight, so to make it a bit more light under there, I thought it would be nice to have a window. If you're wondering why I'm doing the rough opening for the window after the wall was already up, well, sometimes plans change and you just gotta roll with it. It's looking a little bit rough here. I'm certainly not an expert on soffits, but even I could tell that this section needed to be replaced, and since I was going to be building the wall around this roof line, I figured it would be easier to replace them now before anything was built. I basically just replicated the piece that was already there using some treated CDX plywood, and after cutting out a couple vent holes with a jigsaw, I popped the piece in place and mounted it with some nails. With the framing for the wall up, the next step was to put up some sheathing for more structural support. I did have to come back and add a few nailing strips in a couple places just to make sure that the nailing surfaces were relatively level to each other. I'm using 7/16 inch OSB panels for the sheathing and a track saw to make all my cuts. I'm not sure how much footage I show in this video for me making actual cuts for all these boards and panels, but if you're curious on the tools I've used up to this point, I've pretty much done all the on-site cutting with a track saw and a jigsaw. I used the track saw for all the straight line cuts, so for the sheathing here it was incredibly helpful, and anytime I need to do curves or a notch around obstacles, I used the jigsaw. When I did have to chop some boards to length, like for the framing, I used a track saw as well, although it's kind of janky for that application. Ideally, I would have had a chop saw on site or a miter saw, or even a circular saw would have been easier, but you gotta make do with what you have. Well, it was 95 degrees last week, and yesterday decided to dump a bunch of snow, which isn't ideal for these outdoor projects. One thing I didn't even think about when taking on this job was the challenge of the elements, and for some reason the weather decided to turn apocalyptic during this build with snow one day and 90s a couple days later. I mean, this job was already pretty difficult for me and the weather certainly wasn't helping. But it turns out this is like the driest spring we've had here in like 100 years, so the random snowstorm that came and went pretty fast. For the LED lights, I'm just plugging it in at this junction box here. Running it through the wall. I'm just mounting the transformer inside the wall and then running the wire up. I'll have the cord come out the top of the sheathing there. Since I went full-time into woodworking and YouTube, I would say in general the types of builds I've done have been pretty variable, but the one constant that has persisted is having a lighting component as part of my builds, and this one is no different. I planned on installing outdoor LED lights inset onto the risers just to light the staircase up at night, which I'm hoping will add that pizzazz needed to set this staircase apart. Before I can get to the lighting though, I needed to finish up this wall, and to help protect the structure from moisture, I added this layer of house wrap, which I'm just stapling and taping onto the top of the sheathing. For the finished material that we're going to put on this wall, we decided on wood siding, and to make the transitions look a little better between the different materials, I added some trim along the inside and outside edges. I used a scribe to mark and a jigsaw to cut these so that the trim sits pretty flush to the wall. It's close enough. I was able to get away with not having a miter saw on site up to this point, but now that it's time to do the siding, it was finally time to break out the big guns here and set up a miter saw, and the amount of time I'm going to save with this absolutely justifies hauling this thing back here, and I was fortunate enough to have an old miter saw that I pulled out of storage for this job. I started first by nailing a starter strip along the bottom and then tacked in the first row of siding, taking extra care to make sure it was level because the remainder of the rows above were going to be using that first row as a reference. The star of the show for sure are these two green siding jigs, and basically what these do is clamp into the row that's already tacked onto the wall, and at the top of them there's a little notch where you can drop in the next board to be nailed in the row above. And this solves two of the main challenges with siding. One is that it keeps the boards with a consistent overlap and spacing all the way up the wall, and two, they hold the board in place while you nail them so your hands can be free to do the nailing, which is an absolute must for a one-man crew like me.
Alright, there's my shape.
There are thousands of jigs out there for all kinds of different jobs, and obviously some are more effective than others, but this is one of those where it's really just a no-brainer to pick these up, and it just makes the process so simple and easy. I waited to do the siding around the window opening until I had the window in place. That way I could get the siding to fit tight up against the casing, and so that was my next step. It's back in my safe space, i.e. the shop, to make this window, and I'm actually using the same stained decking boards that I used earlier for the treads for the window frame. I cut out all the angled frame pieces on the miter saw and added a dado groove in the middle of each board for the plexiglass window to sit in. Instead of a square window, I added this little dog ear on one of the corners, which really I had to compensate for the angle of the stair stringer while also mounting the window at a decent height. I cut the dog ear on the plexiglass as well, just on the miter saw, and I mounted that into the frame after adding some caulk in the grooves and using some miter clamps and pins to hold the frame together while the glue dried. While I was at it, I also cut out the pieces for the window casing, and I went ahead and mounted them to one side of the frame. That way I could stage it in place in the rough opening and have a nice positive stop when pushing it in. Unsurprisingly, I'm going with the same stained decking boards that I used for the frame, also for the casing. I just ripped them down to about 1.5 inches width. After the window was staged, I got back on the siding, and I should mention that I was going with the LP Smart Side siding from Lowe's, which come in these 16-foot lengths, and I couldn't fit those in my truck, so I brought my cordless jigsaw and started cutting them in half in the Lowe's parking lot so that they would fit. I really didn't want to pay that $80 delivery charge. I had a lofty goal to try and make this hollowed out nook under the stairs as waterproof as I could. That way you could store stuff under there without having to worry about it getting soaked in the rain. I didn't think it would be possible to have the treads and risers tight enough to prevent water from coming through them, so instead what I came up with was mounting some corrugated roofing panels to the underside of the stairs and keeping them sloped towards the bottom, with the idea here being that the panels would catch all the rain that makes it through the treads and drains out at the bottom of the stairs. I had a brief pouty moment here because the wood mounting strips kept splitting on me when I drove in the screws. But eventually I got the panels mounted, and I made sure to overlap them a bit so there weren't any joints with potential leaks, and I also used roofing screws with rubber washers to also seal the screw holes. To finish off the nook, I thought it would be a nice look to continue the siding theme from the outside facing wall and continue that into the inside facing wall with the same siding. Only difference being that I wouldn't overlap the boards, since in theory there wouldn't be any water under here. So instead I would just mount them flat against the sheathing. After adding trim to all the corners and edges of the underside, I started installing the siding, and this went really fast since I was just adding a layer of cladding and face nailing the boards right into the sheathing in between the trim pieces. I didn't end up filming it here, but I did come back and add the window casing on the inside facing part of the window as well. That way I had all the final areas laid out that needed to be covered with this siding. I also added a small section of cladding to the side of the house, which really gave the nook a more complete look, and this was a bit trickier. I landed on mounting a couple 2x4s right onto the stucco with some specialized stucco screws. I've never used these before, but they did seem to have some decent holding power. With the siding all up, it was finally time to do some painting, and I had to be pretty strategic with this since I wanted all of the trim and the siding and the posts to be white, but for those mahogany colored boards like the stair treads and the window frame, I wanted to keep those that contrasting darker color. So I came back and took off all of those boards so I could spray the paint on without having to worry about getting white paint all over them. I did my best to caulk up any cracks to keep out moisture from getting in the nook, but I know that I'm not going to fully be able to waterproof this thing, but it will definitely be water resistant. Now the paint I bought was an exterior semi-gloss, and they say that it is a paint and a primer, but for these plastic roofing panels I wanted to make certain that the paint would adhere, so I ended up adding a coat of this spray primer just for this section, just to make sure. My general strategy for painting large areas is to hand paint all of the edges with a roller and brush, and then use the sprayer to knock out all of the large areas in between. I just found that it makes spraying a lot easier to not have to tippy-toe around the edges. I purposely picked a really hot day to paint, and that way it would dry fast and I wouldn't have to worry about the wind kicking up a bunch of dust on the wet paint. This worked pretty well actually, but of course the trade-off is that you have to work really fast or else the paint will get all gunked up on the different brushers and rollers. The edging is definitely the most tedious part and took me about 80% of the total time, but now it was time to bring in the heavy artillery and go to town on this piece.
Can we get serious now?
With the painting all done, I remounted the window and the treads back onto the staircase and then got to work on the LED lights that would be flush mounted onto the risers. I ended up doing 2 lights on each riser, and I just used a Forstner bit and a drill press to bore out the holes for the lights. A drill press is definitely not necessary here, it just makes the process go faster and keeps the holes nice and straight. After painting all the risers the same white color as the rest of the staircase, I popped in all the lights, making sure to thread the wiring through, and then I mounted them all back to where I had them before, and as I worked my way up the stairs, I connected all the wiring components and just tucked the cords behind the boards. These are outdoor rated waterproof lights, so there shouldn't be any issue with rainwater getting on these. I also came back and added some white solar light post caps onto the posts just to dress them up a little bit more. And these were sneakily one of my favorite adds because they were pretty inexpensive and really gave the railing a much more finished look than just the bare 4x4. At this point the stairs were starting to look pretty nice, but I knew it needed something more just to give it that extra flair I wanted for these stairs. The client mentioned that he liked that mahogany color of the treads, so I thought it'd be cool if I added a bunch more of these and trimmed out the handrails with the same color and material. So I got to work staining and cutting about a linear mile of these decking boards to line the hand railing sections. Installing these actually went pretty swiftly. The main key was to make sure that all the angled cuts were the same angles as the 4x4 posts, with a few minor adjustments here and there. I attached everything with some decking screws, and for the top handrail boards, since they were going to be taking more stress with people using them going up and down the stairs, I reinforced those with more of those 6-inch timber screws. Once I started getting these on, I knew immediately that this was the right choice. They really popped with that white structure as the base of everything, and I really liked how the boards were a bit wider than the railing structure, so it had a slight overhang that hid any imperfections and gaps, and also just gave the whole staircase a much beefier, stronger look. I had seen these really cool nature panels on Etsy that had been sitting in the back of my head throughout this build, and I really wanted to try and replicate them as best I could. I have a pretty small CNC machine, so I knew I couldn't make those large panels, but I thought it would still be cool to have some smaller custom panels that I could carve myself and mount them into those railing gaps. I'm pretty new to the CNC world, but these panels represented a unique challenge to me from a design perspective because I wanted some nature scenes that I could carve all the way through the board so you could see the design from both sides of the stairs. And while a lot of the designs I was finding looked really cool, they didn't quite work for cutting the panels all the way through, so I did have to modify several of these quite a bit to take out as much material as possible so you could see the shape while keeping some basic structure in place to keep all the pieces attached to the panel. And speaking of the panels, I ended up going with some 1x12 pine boards, yet again stained with that mahogany stain and sealer. I mean, why break precedent at this point? I landed on 10 different designs, all basically nature themed, except for one that I made with the Seattle Seahawks emblem. And this was just based on the fact that the client was from Washington and he had a Seahawk painted on the curb in front of his house. Now you may or may not have seen, but I'm often wearing 49ers gear in these videos, so needless to say, I was dealing with quite a bit of eternal strife. But as my boss at my all-time favorite job working at Sports Authority once said, the customer is always right, and I had to make an exception in this case.
Oh no. Oh shit. Yeah, this one didn't turn out quick swap.
I did mention that I am pretty new to CNCing, and I actually lost count of how many of these panels I ruined using the wrong settings or cut depths, or just the design was bad. This one here was a real doozy, almost caused a fire in my shop. Definitely make sure you secure that workpiece down. Eventually I did get the settings dialed in, and if you're curious, I am using the easel software for basically all the design modifications and carving processes. And the CNC machine I'm using is the Genmitsu 4040 Reno made by SainSmart. And this one has about a 16 by 16 cutting area, so 15 inches was about the maximum height for my designs. And depending on the complexity of the design, the panels were averaging about 3 hours each to cut. But I have no idea how many hours I lost trying to dial in the settings. Ideally, I would have had the panels built into the trim boards I added to the railing already, but I really couldn't conceptualize how to do that effectively, while still making sure that the trim boards lined up to the railing nice and tight the way I put them in already. So the best alternative I could come up with to mount these panels into the railing was to make these mounting blocks with a groove down the middle. And so I planned on just screwing these into the railing boards and then sliding the panels into place and nailing them off to secure them in their final position. I do think the panels looked pretty good with the exposed wood edges on the cut lines, but it did look kind of unfinished, and while I would have liked to have stained those the same color as the face, it would have been basically impossible to get the stain in those tiny areas with a brush, and spraying stain is the absolute worst. It just gets everywhere and makes one hell of a mess. But never discount the usefulness of having some spray paint handy, and this was perfect for darkening those edges and giving the panels a much more finished look. The black actually blended pretty seamlessly with the dark brown, but I ended up cleaning up the faces anyway with a rag soaked in mineral spirits, which took the paint off after a bit of elbow grease. All that was left to do now was figure out the best places to mount these panels and throw them in place. I messed around with the spacing a bit so you could see most of them from the side, and thankfully these mounting blocks I made earlier worked exactly as I'd hoped and looked fairly natural in those railing gaps. Just so nice when something goes according to plan. I mean, normally I would have a bunch of footage of some catastrophic problem here in the final moments, but truthfully, I was through the crux at this point and I was just cruising to the finish line. The client was actually on travel for a lot of the build, so he hadn't seen a lot of the progress I'd been making. And for the last bits of it, he was in Europe for a couple of weeks, and I requested that he not look at the stairs when he got back. That way we could kind of have a reveal shot of him seeing the stairs for the first time. I bugged him to see if he'd be willing to do the final shots literally hours after he got back from Europe. But he was a great sport about it and agreed to fight through the jet lag for me to come back with my camera for one last time. Just pulled up for the big reveal. Gotta get ready. Good to go. Hey, I'm all set up out here if you're ready to head out.
Hey. Hey. Oh, the custom railing's beautiful. Yeah. Oh, the Seahawks up there for me? Yeah. Dude, it's awesome. It's beautiful. Let me go up there. Yeah, it's good, Aaron. All this for $40,000?
50.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I gotta say, I'm really happy with the final result. And this was definitely a challenging project, but also one of the most fun. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave any feedback or questions for me in the comments below, and I will see you on the next one.